Quadratic equations, an overview. In mathematics you can come across multiple types of quadratic equations. One of these equations is, for example, 2x squared minus 18 is equal to 0. If you want to solve this, you will have to note that there is an x squared in one term and the other term has no x at all. So in this case you can write down 2x squared is equal to positive 18 because I added 18 on both sides. Now, if I want to solve this further, I can divide both sides by 2. To get x squared is equal to 9. Now, we need two numbers that squared give 9. That is either x is 3 or x is negative 3. Because when I square a negative number, it becomes positive. And you'll come across lots of quadratic equations, and lots of them will have two answers. Some have no answers and some have 0 answers. But we'll address that a little later. Now, let's make this a little smaller, give some more space for a new equation. Let's look at 3x squared. 3x squared minus 12x is equal to 0. Now in this equation you'll note that there's an x squared in this term and an x in this term. So both terms have at least one x. So we cannot use this method on this equation. We can, however, since there is at least one x in both squares, divide out 1x. So x times 3x minus 12 is equal to 0. You can also note that there's a 3 in this term and a 12, which is 3 times 4 in this term. So I can also divide out 3. So I can get 3x times x minus 4 is equal to 0. Now we can use a little something which we will often use in quadratic equation, which is one thing times another thing is equal to 0. So one of these things should be 0. So either 3x is 0 or x minus 4 is 0. So we need a few more steps. In this case I divide both sides by 3, and dividing 0 by 3 will still be 0. And in this case I add 4 on both sides to get x is 4. Again, two solutions of one equation. Now let's make this a little smaller as well. And drop it over there. Then, what I can do next is write down this equation. X squared plus x minus 20 is equal to 0. This equation has 3 terms, one with an x squared, one with just x, and one without an x. So I can't use either of these methods. So what I'm going to do is I try to use the product sum method. Where I will try to find two numbers that multiplied is equal to -20 and where the sum is 1. Okay, so let's -20 minus 10 and 2, for example, multiplied, this becomes -20. However, if I add them together, -10 plus 2 is a -8. But I'm looking for, well, 1. Let's write that in to help us. I'm looking for 1. So -10 and 2 are not the answers. Well, how about +10 and -2? That'll give us a +8, still not 1. So what we do know is since we need to end up at 1, we need two numbers that are quite close together. And 10 and 2 aren't close together. 20 can also be written down as something with a 4 and something with a 5. So if I do +4 and -5, then adding them together would give me a -1. Not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a +1, but I'm nearly there. How about a -4 and a +5? Gives me a +1. So these are the two numbers I'm looking for, a -4 and a +5. Again, we use the little trick, something times something is 0, so one of these things must be equal to 0. So either this one or this one. And we use one more step to actually solve it for x, giving me x is 4 or x is -5. So that's one more equation. And I'm moving this someplace else and write down a fourth equation. 2x squared minus x minus 6 is equal to 0. So in this case, if we want to use the product sum method, we first have to get rid of this 2. We can do that by dividing both sides by 2. But if I do that, I obtain x squared minus a half x minus 3 is equal to 0. Now, this doesn't necessarily make it better, because there's a half here, which is as annoying as that 2. So that's not going to work. But I can work from here. In this case, we need to complete the square. So first we're going to write it down like x squared minus a half x is equal to 3. Get that 3 out of the way. And then I write down x. And then I add the half of negative half. So in this case, a half of negative half is a negative quarter squared. But if I multiply out these brackets again, I have the square of 1/4 too much, so I need to compensate for that. And if I want to solve this any further, I need to create some space. But if I want to solve this even further, I move the negative 1/16 to the other side, so I get x minus 1/4 squared is 3/1/16, or 16 times 3 plus 1 is 49/16. Now, the next step we need to do is we need to take the square root of this. But remember, when I take the square root of this, I take the positive square root and the negative square root. So in this case I get x minus of 1/4 is equal to the square root of this 7/4, or x minus 1/4 is negative 7/4. Again, let's create some space. Let's put it over here. I need one more step. X is equal to 7/4 plus 1/4 is 8/4, or 2. Or x is equal to negative 7/4 plus 1/4 is equal to negative 6/4, or 1, negative 1/2. So again, one equation, two answers. And let's put this where it belongs, right over there. Now let's look at a different equation. We have seen basically all four methods. One where you have an x squared in one term and no x in the other term. We have one where there is 3x squared, so an x squared in one term and one x in the other term. We have two with an x squared and x. One of them could be solved by using product sum, and one could only be solved by using completing the square. So are there any other types? Well, this is basically the four solving methods, and completing the square always works, unless it doesn't. Let's look at an example where it doesn't. Let's look at x squared plus 8x plus 17 is equal to 0. In this case, we start by x squared plus 8x moving 17 to the other side is equal to negative 17. And we are going to complete the square with this part. So x plus half of 8 squared minus 4 squared is negative 17. So in this case, x plus 4 squared is negative 16 plus 16. Negative 17 plus 16 is negative 1. And this cannot be solved because this is positive and this is negative. There is simply no way that one hand of the equation can be positive while the other is negative. So there is no solution possible. So we simply write down no solution. So I said before that a quadratic equation has often has two answers. This one had two answers, this one had two answers, this one had two answers, and this one had two answers. Now this equation has no answers. There's no solution. There's no solution possible. I also mentioned that some equations have one solution. Let's look at the following equation now. X squared minus x plus 1/4 is equal to 0. And let's see what happens if we try to solve this. There's a fraction, so doing product sum though possible, is not preferable, and instead we're going to use completing the square. So first we move the quarter to the other side, -1/4, and then we use completing the square, so x squared minus 1x, x minus the half of 1, or half squared, minus the square of a half is -1/4. If we multiply out these brackets, we'll get x minus a half squared minus 1/4 is -1/4. And we move this 1/4 to the other side to obtain x minus a half squared is equal to 0. So we did all this, and instead of a number, such as in our previous example, here we had two answers because we ended up with a number that was not equal to 0. But in this case, I want to take the square root and the negative square root of 0, but they're both the same. What number do I need to square to obtain 0? Well, that is simply 0. And since there is no negative version of 0, there is only one solution. And that solution is x is equal to a half. So when a quadratic equation is given, you can solve it, and then one of three options will occur. There are two solutions. There is one solution. Or there is no solution. And depending on the situation, one of these three will happen. So here you have something squared is a positive number. Here you have something squared is equal to 0. And here you get something squared is a negative number. So this was an overview of some quadratic equations. I will make videos doing all of these solving methods in more detail, but for now, an overview with two terms, both with an x, one with x squared, or three terms using product sum or using completing the square. And in both, and in all cases, you can have either two solutions, one solution, or no solution.